So far in this series, we've looked at the problem of evil, the Deus ex machina and infra dignitatem arguments, parsimonious creation, dysteleology, and religious rationalism and deism. Now in this video, we're going to look at miracles. Miracles have always traditionally been a pillar of the Christian faith. At the Last Supper, Jesus was going through some deep theology with his apostles, and the apostle Philip at one point said to Jesus, well, gee, just show us the Father and that will be enough for us. Now that must have been disappointing for Jesus after having all the things that he had done and all the things they had witnessed, for Philip to say something like that. And so Jesus gave Philip a good response, and he finished up by saying, at least believe on the evidence of the works themselves. Jesus was referring to the many miracles that he had performed. And so miracles have always been traditionally a pillar of the Christian faith. You can believe because of the miracles. By the middle of the 18th century, call it 1750, that had more or less reversed. For many Christians now, miracles were looked down upon. There was a flip. So what happened with that? And we're going to look at how that came about, the religious thinking behind it, the religious motivations for that, and how that has influenced Origen's thinkings and the theory of evolution. So in the, call it the 17th century, 1600s, there was a lot of interest and a lot of thinking about miracles, but there was a lot of skepticism growing. I'm just going to go through several of the different problems that were arising. One was miracles in the 17th century were increasingly used to judge the doctrine, judge your doctrine. If you had miracles, if you didn't have miracles, what kind of miracles happened to you or your tradition. One example is the philosopher and mathematician Blaise Pascal. You remember Pascal from your high school biology class, Pascal's triangle. Pascal was a Roman Catholic, and his niece was reportedly miraculously healed of an eye problem. Now, within the Roman Catholic Church, Pascal was a follower of Cornelius Jansen. Jansen was more aligned with the reformers, the Protestant reformers, and thinkers such as John Calvin. That put him somewhat at odds with the Roman Catholic Church. They weren't too crazy about Jansenism. Pascal said that this miraculous healing of his niece's eye problem was a sign of the Jansenism was on the right track. The Roman Catholic Church came back and said, well, not quite. It's actually a warning. You're getting a warning. This miraculous healing. They didn't challenge the miraculous healing. There was a substantial evidence for this, but they turned it around and made it into a warning. So miracles were sometimes used to support or to reject doctrine, depending on which side of the issue you were on. But this was not appropriate, and in the end, this had the effect of diluting the importance of miracles. Similarly, the Roman Catholics were challenging the Protestants. So you had the new Protestant church coming out of the 16th century Reformation. And the Roman Catholics said, well, we've got all these miracles here. And the Roman Catholics were very serious about this. They documented carefully the miracle reports and critically analyzed them. So they had a lot of documentation and evidence for miracles. The Protestants didn't have that tradition. And so the Roman Catholics could challenge the Protestants. We've got all these miracles. Where are your miracles? Attesting to your doctrines. Well, as you can imagine, that didn't sit too well with Protestants. It could have the effect of diluting the importance of miracles again, because, well, we don't have those miracles here. We don't have that documentation, at least. Maybe it's not so important. Within Protestant circles, a new doctrine arose about that time called cessationism. So what is cessationism? The doctrine of cessationism is that, yes, there were all these miracles recorded in the New Testament times, but they no longer occur today. Those miracles ceased. It's not that God can't do miracles. It's not that they cannot occur, but they just don't occur anymore. There's different variations on this doctrine, but the general idea is the miracles of the New Testament have ceased. They were for the special purpose of that time. Nowadays, we don't have those. In the church down the street from you might well adhere to cessationism. It's very common to this day. And the Roman Catholics eventually got on board with this as well. This became a popular doctrine. But you can imagine it also grew out of and contributed to a dilution of the importance of miracles. Of course, no cessationist would put it that way. They're not going to say, well, miracles are not important. They're fully acknowledging the historicity, the reality of miracles in the New Testament times and Old Testament times. But still, you have this doctrine downplaying miracles. It's going to have that effect of downplaying miracles, put it that way. Finally, another religious problem with miracles was enthusiasm and weak faith. Miracles were viewed as being required by those with weak faith and feeding into enthusiasm. Enthusiasm is where you get all riled up and excited about something, about your faith, and it doesn't make for a long-term stable faith. It crumbles easily. So enthusiasm was another problem. So he had all these different religious problems going on, contributing to the dilution of the importance of miracles. This led to what historians call the Great Debate, which occurred in the first half of the 18th century, called 1700 to 1750. It occurred in Britain, and it's called the Great Debate because it involved so many theologians, philosophers, and scientists, raged on for decades, and a lot of skepticism was raised against miracles, religiously based skepticism, religious problems with the idea that God would use miracles, would do these miracles. It didn't make sense. God wouldn't do it that way, all sorts of different reasons. So a lot of skepticism against miracles. Now, toward the tail end of that period, mid-century, 1748, historian and philosopher David Hume published his book, Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding. In chapter 10 of that book, which Hume entitled Of Miracles, Hume mounted a massive attack against miracles. Now, Hume didn't claim that miracles could not occur. He claimed that we don't have strong evidence for them. In fact, the evidence is weak. They probably didn't occur. We certainly can't know that they occurred, was his sort of argument. The argument goes like this. You have miracles, and Hume acknowledged the substantial evidence for miracles that the church had. So you have, on the one hand, you have miracles and the evidence for them. That evidence needs to be weighed against the evidence for natural law. So he set miracles up against natural law in a dichotomy. You've got one or the other. You can't have both. The argument is logically fallacious. I won't go through all the details. It should be kind of obvious that it is a false dichotomy, simply put. Now, John Ehrman, a professor at Pitt, a philosophy professor, has written a book about Hume, and he calls it Hume's Abject Failure. And he writes in his book, I find it astonishing how well posterity has treated of miracles, given how completely the confection collapses under a little probing. But it took centuries for this to come out. Now, there were criticisms of Hume's work, of chapter 10 at the time, but they didn't carry the day. They weren't influential. Hume's attack on miracles, criticism of miracles, was more influential. It carried the day. It became influential. And that really speaks to the times, and he was tickling the ear. He was sending a message that people wanted to hear, and that's the point. After Hume, miracles were increasingly looked down upon. They were no longer an apologetic, they were a liability, they were looked at in bad taste. This continued on into the next century, the 19th century, Charles Darwin's time, when Charles Darwin started to think about the origin of species. In his circles, this was definitely the trend. Miracles were not looked in favor. It's better to have the world arise by natural law. Baden-Powell was an Anglican cleric. He was a math professor at Oxford, and he wrote about this. And he was very much on the side of no miracles. Miracles do not occur. And let me read to you one quote from Baden-Powell, the Reverend Baden-Powell, about the origin of species. This was prior to Darwin publishing his book on evolution. Quote, "But however little we know of the laws or causes of these changes, one thing is perfectly clear. The introduction of new species was a regular, not a causal phenomenon. It was not one preceding or transcending the order of nature. It was a case occurring in the midst of ordinary operations, going on in accordance with ordinary causes." So, new species arise by ordinary natural law. That was the message. And Darwin acknowledged Baden-Powell. He acknowledged Powell in later editions of his book, Origin of Species. And in Darwin's book, he occasionally sniped at the idea of miracles and kind of looked askance and said, gee, well, we can't really believe in miracles anyway, right? Let me read to you one quote from Origin of Species. "These authors seem no more startled at a miraculous act of creation than at an ordinary birth. But do they really believe that in innumerable periods in the Earth's history, certain elemental atoms have been commanded suddenly to flash into living tissues?" So Darwin was able to make these sorts of arguments freely without justification. The groundwork had been laid. The foundation was there. You could just kind of like, well, of course, miracles don't really occur. Do you really believe this? There's an old saying, he who frames the debate wins the debate. And Darwin here is framing the debate. If you can frame the debate as, well, miracles are impossible anyway, miracles don't happen anyway, well, of course, then evolution must be true. But it's all because of these religious arguments against miracles, diluting miracles, doubting miracles, skepticism of miracles. After Darwin, this would just go on, and it would become just kind of a given. Occasionally you'll see in the evolution literature these sorts of statements against miracles. I'll read to you one from Mark Ridley's evolution textbook from 1993. "In the scientific version of the theory which we are concerned with here, supernatural events do not take place." So, there you have it. Miracles just don't happen. A long religious history behind this. Religious concerns, religious arguments diluting or opposed to miracles, leading up to this rejection of miracles. Well, of course, if there's no miracles, then of course evolution must be true one way or another, and it's just kind of a given in the literature. Religion drives science, and it matters.